The following program is a UW-TV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Hello and welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. In the world of academia, Henry Louis Gates Jr. is a superstar. A literary scholar and cultural theorist, Gates was wooed by some of this nation's most prestigious universities before accepting the challenge of chairing and revitalizing the Afro-American Studies program at Harvard, where he is also a professor of English and humanities. The author of several scholarly books and countless articles, Gates's newest work is far more intimate. Colored People, a Memoir, is the deeply personal and often very funny story of his upbringing in a small West Virginia town in the segregated 1950s. Welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you very much.
When you pick up a book that's about this time in American history, it's a pretty good assumption that you're going to read about gains and about advances. But this book is also very much about what?
It's about the paradox of loss in the midst of gain. And I wanted to write about what we called at the time the colored world of the 1950s. I was born in 1950. And I wanted to mimic a video camera or a microphone or a fly on the wall, say in our living room circa 1955 or 1960 and 1965, and talk about what we talked about, how we were as a people when no white people were around, when the doors of white racism slammed shut and we were together, intimate, how we created a culture, how we thrived, how we attempted to survive and endure.
What did you think the big surprises would be for people who got to eavesdrop?
I think how healthy and how warm, how nurturing that culture was. You know, if you read so much of contemporary black literature or sociological studies or particularly the newspapers, you would think that most black people come from dysfunctional or pathological families and cultures. But that's not the way it was. I mean, we were people of the book. We were people who were striving to do better, to know and test the Kabbalistic letters of the white man, as the great black scholar Du Bois put it. Yeah, I read a survey recently that was published in the Washington Post of inner-city black kids in D.C., and it said that the following things were listed as things white for these black kids. One was getting straight A's. One was speaking English properly. One was going to the Smithsonian Institute. If any of us had said that kind of thing when we were growing up, they would have shipped us off to a lunatic asylum. I mean, we were a people determined to get our chunk of the American system, to integrate this system, and to knock those barriers of racism down.
That tension, I guess, between defiance and assimilation has always been a part of black life, but it seems so much stronger now, so much more pointed.
Well, I think that now we have the worst economic statistics that we've ever had. You know, actually, the situation is even more complex than that. We have, paradoxically and simultaneously, the largest black middle class in history and the largest black underclass in history. So the class matters, to paraphrase Cornel West, in a way today than that it didn't matter 30 years ago. Which is not to say that we didn't have class distinctions in the black community, of course we did. But now, those people who would have lived in black communities under segregation and been members of the middle class, now by and large live in integrated neighborhoods, either in yuppie, reclaimed, brownstone sort of neighborhoods in places like New York, or in the suburbs. So that the role model aspect, which the distinguished black sociologist at the University of Chicago, William Julius Wilson, has recently written about, having role models in your neighborhood has disappeared. Being able to aspire to go to college or become trained in a job that with a future, you know, not just flipping hamburgers at McDonald's. All those things for a full 60% of our community have disappeared.
I wanted to have you set the scene by reading a section from your book that gives people a feel for the book as a whole.
I'd be glad to. Actually, it's so nice to have written a book that people actually read instead of one more book of literary criticism, and people actually get pleasure out of this.
It's a hard book to put down.
It's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before 1955, most white people were only shadowy presences in our world, vague figures of power like remote bosses at the mill or tellers at the bank. There were exceptions, of course. The white people who would come into our world in ritualized, everyday ways that we all understood. Mr. Mailman, Mr. Insurance Man, Mr. White and Chocolate Milk Man, Mr. Landlord Man, Mr. Policeman. We called white people by their trade like allegorical characters in a mystery play. Mr. Insurance Man would come by every other week to collect premiums on college or death policies, sometimes 50 cents or less. But my favorite white visitor, without a doubt, was the Jewel Tea Man, who arrived in his dark brown, helmet-shaped truck, a sort of modified Jeep, and, like the Sears man, brought new appliances to our house. I loved looking at his catalogs. Mr. Jewel Tea Man, may I see your catalogs, please? Or there were doctors. Mine was young Doc Wolverton. We dressed up when we went to see the doctor. That made sense because I wanted to be a doctor. Mama wanted both of her sons to be doctors. Young Doc Wolverton owned our house, or at least the house we moved to when I was 4. And that was another thing. As much as we belonged to Piedmont, as much as Piedmont belonged to us, colored weren't allowed to own property, not until the 1970s anyway. All our houses were rented from white landowners. All our houses were rented from white landowners, and that was just the way it was. It drove my mother crazy. Before we lived at the house rented from Doc Wolverton, we lived in a much smaller house, at the base of Big Mom's Hill, or at the top of Fredlock Street before the blacktop ran out and Big Mom's gravel driveway started. My sense of that house comes more from Mama's recollections of it than from my own. Some of her memories feel like my own, like the day in 1951 when Bobby Thompson hit a home run in the bottom of the ninth to beat the Dodgers and win the pennant for the Giants, and my daddy went absolutely crazy and began to hop from chair to table to sofa to chair, round and round the perimeter of our living room. It scared me so much that I started to cry. And of course, we would bump into the white world at the hospital in Kaiser, or at the credit union in Westernport, or in one of the stores downtown. But our neighborhoods were clearly demarcated, as if by ropes or turnstiles. Welcome to the colored zone, a large stretch banner could have said. And it felt good in there, like walking around your house in bare feet and underwear, or snoring right out loud on the couch in front of the TV, swaddled by the comforts of home, the warmth of those you love.
When I read that part of your book, I was reminded, you mentioned Cornel West, of a phrase that he used about cultural armor. Mm-hmm. And the armor that this kind of community provided, and an armor that really no longer exists for so many young people.
That's right. I think for those of us who have been determined to preserve it in the professional class or the middle classes, we still have that armor. But for the large percentage of the black community, impoverished by structural poverty, that armament of culture, of social institution, of art, no longer exists, or is more difficult to come by.
Can you trace the disintegration of that armor to integration? I mean, do those two things go hand in glove somehow?
Well, scholars do trace them to integration, but it's not a relationship of cause and effect. There are a series of complex factors that overlap. The changing nature of American industry, the elimination of certain sorts of jobs in which blacks predominated, the end of the Cold War, slowly, gradually after Vietnam. Do you know that it would take trillions of dollars to get back the demographic data, the socioeconomic conditions that obtained the day that Dr. King was shot? And Dr. King was protesting what he felt to be inhumane socioeconomic conditions for poor people and for black people. But that looked like the golden age compared to where we are now. The black middle class was smaller, but so was the black underclass. And to get back to where we were would take massive federal and corporate intervention. And that's what we need. This program is not going to come about by magic. We need the equivalent of a Marshall Plan for the cities, which the National Urban League calls for every year. We need a systematic, large-scale assault on the structural causes of poverty. And until we do, the nightmare reality of the inner city is only going to get more nightmarish.
Any inclination that you see that kind of plan would be put in effect?
I'm looking far and wide, and I don't see it yet. Many of us, I think, voted for President Clinton because we felt that at least there was a possibility under a Democratic administration, and I still hope so. But you know, I think part of the problem too is that no one has quite been able to figure out the compounding effect of race and class. And I think that our think tanks, university professors, the research centers such as the Du Bois Institute for Afro-American Research at Harvard, which I direct, that we all together have to begin analyzing how race and class impact upon each other, and preparing white papers, preparing studies, engaging in public policy, lobbying, public policy, data dissemination, so that we can come up with meaningful programs that will help to cure this problem. Look, I think at the best, we can only expand the size of the middle class. But if we did that, that would be a dramatic change, particularly for people of color, and more particularly for African Americans. A dramatic change over the terrible conditions that we see today.
Your reputation is as a literary scholar, a cultural theorist, but the discussion we've had today is much more political and economic. Is that one of the responsibilities that you see as part of an Afro-American Studies program? Those issues all somehow interwoven, interlocked.
Well, I would never make rules for other scholars of Afro-American Studies or other programs. But in our department, over the past 3 years, I've only been there for 3 years, we concentrate mostly on the humanities, on cultural studies, as it's generally called today. But in our research institute, we're beginning to concentrate on public policy. It's hard to do everything. Most departments of Afro-American Studies are very small, and I think that they should specialize in something. We're growing. The addition of Cornel West to our ranks is a major coup. I feel like the coach of the dream team, player coach. Cornell is the Michael Jordan of Afro-American Studies, and it's exciting. And also his coming will lead us into public policy formation, will make the formation of working groups, the lobbying for broader structural change, a fundamental part of what we do. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to hire him.
It'll give the school at Harvard the high profile that he predicted it would have when you took the job.
That's right.
Why Harvard? In the introduction I mentioned you could have gone anywhere you wanted to.
Well, not anywhere, but maybe close. Harvard offered me, it was a fantasy for me. I always envied those people who were starting Afro-American Studies departments in the late 1960s. I never particularly cared about Harvard. I was a Yalie. I still, in New York, stay at the Yale Club, right? I mean, I was a loyal old blue, not so old blue, maybe, not so young blue. But the reason that it was a fantasy, the reason that their offer was ideal is that they had only one professor there. There was no deadwood. I mean, I didn't have to go in and clear away the space.
There wasn't much there at all.
There wasn't much there at all. There was one very distinguished professor who was a German named Werner Zollers, and two majors, two concentrators as they're called in Harvard. This year we have 62 concentrators. I came in with 3 other professors whom I helped to hire. One, my best friend Anthony Appiah, the most distinguished African philosopher alive, and 2 junior people. And since then we've hired Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, a distinguished historian, her husband, Leon Higginbotham, who happened to be the most distinguished federal judge in the United States, who is black, and Cornel West. And we plan to make several more equally dramatic and stellar appointments. And then to, I hope, begin a PhD program in Afro-American Studies that will begin to explore questions such as what was the exact nature of classical antiquity, what was the nature of Egypt, you know, those kind of questions. But also to pursue large-scale research projects, which are dear to my heart, such as the editing of the Encyclopedia Africana. You know, we don't have a sophisticated black encyclopedia that encodes all the knowledge about the entire black world. So we've decided, Anthony Appiah and I, to edit a 10-volume, 10-million-word encyclopedia. The great Du Bois, Harvard man, 1890, dreamed this dream in 1910, but because he was so radical, no one would give him the money to do it. And now we're going to do that, and we're going to do it on CD-ROM, so that we as the people can go black to the future.
It's exhausting. I mean, just to hear all of the projects that you have. And it's one of the things that struck me when I read this book, and why I said, to me, as the reader, it was different. It was something different than what you had done. Your career seems like this Ferrari that's roaring down the highway. This book is a very reflective, it has a peacefulness and stillness around it. And I wondered how you found the time and the space to reflect on it.
Well, finding the time to reflect is always difficult, particularly when one's driving a Ferrari. What color is that Ferrari?
I think red.
But specifically, the writing of this book came about at the Rockefeller Foundation Center in northern Italy, in Bellagio, which is near Milan on Lake Como. And I spent 6 weeks there, and it was a miracle. In 4 weeks, I'd knocked out the first draft of this book. And I did it in the form of, I generally write quickly, but I don't write that quickly. I did it in the form of letters that I wrote every day to my two daughters, Maggie and Liza, who at the time were 10 and 12. Each chapter was a letter. I mean, each day for 14 days, I wrote 20 pages to 25 pages, saying, let me tell you about the family reunion which started when I was, 1 year old. Let me tell you about watching Amos and Andy. Let me tell you about the time when black people were trying to integrate Central High School in Little Rock. Let me tell you about the day President Kennedy was shot. I was trying to leave them a record of what my life had been like. But really, I wrote it as a tribute to my mother. And I think, I'm very touched that you said that there was a sense of peace about it. No one said that to me before. My mother died in 1987, and I miss her horribly. I mean, we were very close. I think it was, one of the great lies is that you stop grieving for people you don't stop. At least I haven't stopped grieving for my mother. The nature of that grief is transformed. It assumes different guises, but it continues. And so, and thank God my father, who just turned 81 last week, is still alive and lives with us part of the year.
Contributes much of the humor in this book.
Yeah, he is. He's funny. He makes Red Fox and Richard Pryor look like undertakers,
People just have to read this book. Take our word for it.
Yeah. But
how did your daughters react to the world that you were telling them about?
Well, they've now both read the book. But before that, they reacted like our generation reacted when our parents told us about the Depression. They might as well be talking about the Civil War or the Revolution. I would tell them about Vietnam or the 60s, and they would laugh about hippies. They would look at my class picture, my graduating picture from Yale with a big 2-foot-high afro and the dashiki. They said, "Dad, you look like a Klingon." They said, "It looks like an afro," And I would crack up.
They also were pretty unbelieving about the whole idea that if they had lived at that time, there were places they couldn't go.
Look, you can't imagine what it's like for them to look at a film or to, like Eyes on the Prize, and see a colored only or no colored allowed sign. I mean, it is a bizarre thing, one which we took for granted because we had no choice. But for them, it's like another planet, it's another era. And I think that many of us are writing memoirs in part for that reason. Brent Staples, Nathan McCall, lots and lots of us who are, in our early 40s.
The word colored is very charged. You chose it very deliberately for the title of this book.
I did, not to be provocative, but because it was to be descriptive. That's what we called each other in 1955, at least in my household. And these were colored people. And often today, black people slip and say, "Was it colored?" Was it colored? "Oh, I mean African American." And I also was calling attention to our naming practices, our concern with our identity as expressed through the right to rename ourselves every generation. And I think it's a function of our powerlessness, or at least our sense of powerlessness and the need to express power by saying, "No, don't call me that anymore. That's old, you've just insulted me. I'm now an African American." I remember when we became black, and many of us thought that would be the ultimate name.
That was shocking.
That was the key that unlocked the lock of racism. And then, when that didn't solve all of our problems miraculously, Jesse Jackson holds a press conference and says we're now African Americans, so we all throw out our stationery and rename our organizations. I think that our daughters, I was saying in the introduction, my daughters, I believe their generation will be people or persons of color, and then ultimately colored people, but it's just as likely that they'll be Neo-Nubians or Sisters of the Nile as anything else.
Language is not dead. It's a living thing.
No, and it's exciting. That's one of the things I try to do in this book, to recapture by using my father's stories and his storytelling devices, which I know by heart, to capture the black vernacular, which I think is resplendent and wonderful, very poetic, and deeply capable of expressing emotion.
Mm. There's so much talk about the concern with language on college campuses and everywhere today. I guess the moniker that gets hung on it is politically correct. Seems to be more interest in dogma. I mean, has anybody said, how could you name the book that?
Oh, no.
Question that.
Not to my face, at least. I think that too much has been made of this whole controversy over political correctness. I don't know any professor who fits the stereotype or the parody that the cultural right has invented about political correctness. I mean, there are always extreme cases on the left and the right, such as the woman in England who wouldn't allow her class to go to see Romeo and Juliet because of the tyranny of heterosexual love that it embodied. That's ridiculous. But there are very few cases like that. I mean, most of us believe that texts are complex and sophisticated, and some texts are more complex and sophisticated than other texts, but that they should be taught because they're good, not because the authors are white males. You see, white males have had the ultimate affirmative action in America and in the West for a couple thousand years. And I think now it's time for our notions of beauty and excellence to be expanded to include people of color, from cultures of color, women, gay people, etc. Of course, they always included gay people in the West, they just didn't call them gay.
One of the descriptions I read of you was as a literary archaeologist. You discovered in 1982 the first novel that had been published by a black person in this country, and a finder of lost and misclassified and forgotten works. I mean, is it in a sense a lost civilization that you're finding, rediscovering, getting republished?
I think that's an apt metaphor. I mean, we know quite a lot about African American culture, of course, but there's a lot more that we do not know about. And our generation of scholars of African American studies are doomed to be, or blessed to be, depending on your point of view, archaeologists, discoverers. I mean, we all have a sort of Columbus complex. There's so much of our tradition that's been lost or stolen, to use the phrase of the early Black History series in the 60s that Bill Cosby...
Or Strayed.
Or Strayed, that's right. That Bill Cosby narrated. And it's the mixed blessing of this generation of scholars of Afro-American studies that we have to resurrect our tradition before we analyze it. But there's gold there to be resurrected, like all the writings of black women in the 19th century, or all the information that will be in our Encyclopedia Africana. We lack fundamental reference tools, such as black dictionaries, black encyclopedias, such as concordances, which count every word that a writer uses. Those fundamental tools of knowledge, which other scholars and other traditions can take for granted, our generation will have to produce, like the Norton Anthology of African American Literature, which 11 of us are busy editing even as we speak.
One of the stories from this book reminded me of things surfacing. It was the idea that even though you had this very warm, enveloping community, there was keen interest in people showing up on the horizon, and when a black person would end up being on television. Oh, yes. That was a major event in the day. If you saw a black person on television, you'd run around the house and color on Channel 2, and then you'd call, somebody would pick up the phone and call all your friends, and someone else would run out and shout to the neighbors. It was an event. We saw very few images of black people on television, and often those images were problematic, like maids and domestics and Amos and Andy, which for all its all the problems with that TV program, most of us, at least in my hometown, loved. I mean, it was a sad day in Piedmont when they took Amos and Andy off the air. A woman, a scholar, said that now that there are so many more images, her concern was that these then became fictional substitutes for real contact, that even though that gap that existed in the 1950s doesn't exist in the same way, that images in popular entertainment have sort of taken their place and created a new gap in popular culture. Sure. I know black people
Claire Huxtable, Cliff Huxtable. They were some of my best friends. Yeah, I know what.
Magic Johnson.
Yeah, Magic Johnson. And also demanding that real black people conform to the images projected of them, often by non-black people on television. So it's a curious cycle of representation and misrepresentation. But I think that while I find that theory interesting, I don't buy it. I think that we have more contact across racial and gender lines than we've ever had in this country. I think that it would be a potential danger, the thing that she describes, but I don't think, in fact, that that's the way it is. In fact, one of the things that's most interesting to me about Bill Clinton is that there's never been an American president more comfortable physically around black people. I mean, look at his body language. I mean, look at Richard Nixon. Look at footage of Richard Nixon and George Bush and even President Kennedy. I mean, he was very liberal when it came to race relations. But around black people, or for that matter, around women, they weren't comfortable. These weren't real human beings to them. You know, they might as well be with Martians. They didn't know how to talk to them. They didn't know how to joke with them. They didn't know how to be comfortable with them. And Clinton represents, not so much because of any peculiarities about his personality, but I think it's a generational matter. That Clinton represents a crossover, I think, in terms of familiarity between white people and black people, and that's a positive thing. I think it's generally true.
We sort of come full circle from where we began in talking about gains and advances and losses due to integration, the civil rights movement. In your view, the losses, the advances, or the advances and the gains far outweigh the losses? Oh,
absolutely. But if we could take the best of what was good about our culture, say in 1950, and combine it with the best that came about because of desegregation, then I think we'd be in a lot better position than we are now, and that's essentially what the message of the book is.
And maybe that's the kind of world your daughters will live in.
I hope so.
Henry Louis Gates, Jr., I want to thank you for being a guest on Upon Reflection. Again, your newest book, at least as of this moment, Colored People, a memoir. Thanks again.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Good.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.